Hey everyone. Today we're continuing our conversation on Charles Darwin, and today we're going to talk about how he started to form that theory of natural selection that I mentioned before. We had talked about some of the observations that he's made during his voyage on the HMS Beagle. Really, today's lesson, or this lesson here, we're going to be going into how he connects those observations to inferences and then ultimately into his theory of natural selection for evolution. On the Origin of Species is the name of Charles Darwin's very famous second book, in which he records a lot of his different ideas and his theories about evolution that he sort of came upon as he was doing those travels around the world. So he was nervous and sort of uncomfortable with publishing at first because, as I mentioned, that was a controversial topic at that time. So, as I said there, 1859, it was not public opinion that evolution was really happening. Okay, so he actually held off for a little while because he didn't want to essentially get in trouble for his theory. Meanwhile, another scientist, also very famous, Alfred Wallace, also came up with his own theory very similar to Darwin's, although he had a lot less actual observations. So if you remember, Darwin had been traveling around the world and he had collected lots of samples. He had made lots of really detailed notes and he was looking at all these different types of organisms around the world. So Wallace did not have that advantage. He just sort of came up with this idea. So, what I want to talk about really here is how he formed his theory. So, I'll mention here what the theory is. So, natural selection is the way in which an environment or nature favors reproductive success of individuals. So, what is reproductive success? This is an individual's ability to pass on its genes to the next generation. So, if, for example, the organism dies in infancy before it has had the chance to actually reproduce, it would not have high reproductive success. So, that's something that you'll hear me say often, a high reproductive success, or often called a high fitness. Okay, so if you are unable to survive to reproduction, to be able to reproduce, that is, you would have what's called a low fitness or a low reproductive success. So we're going to come back around to those in just a few minutes. So natural selection, I'm going to show you what observations has he made to actually lead to this theory. So before we even get there, I want to just sort of outline for you what an observation, inference, and then finally a theory is. So the observations are what is actually seen. Okay, these are the actual evidences that he picks up from his travels around the world. An inference is what you think or infer based on what you have observed. Okay. And finally, the theory is the combination of all of your inferences from all evidence that you have to form a theory that can then be applied to other situations, not only the situations that you have actually observed. So that's what we're going to walk through here. And the main evidences that he finds, there's really five main evidences. As I mentioned in the last lesson, he takes them from lots of different places on his travels, and then essentially he puts them together as inferences and then finally his theory. So here, one thing he observes, which might seem kind of obvious, is that each generation will produce more offspring than there are adults. Okay. Then from there, he says, but somehow the populations don't grow in size. So typically, and thinking out in the wild, of course, things like food and resources are limited. Now, you might be thinking to yourself, but wait a second, this doesn't apply to humans. And that is true because humans have sort of overridden this natural selection process. So if you think about what humans do, we have very few children usually in 2020. But we also keep people alive by supplying them food and resources and medicine and all kinds of things. Well, out in nature, that's not actually what happens, and especially not in the 1800s. So, again, these three sort of ideas, or these three observations, I should say, they lead him to think or infer that individuals must be competing for resources. Because, again, if the population doesn't grow, that means there's some competition. Those who are able to eat are able to actually survive and reproduce. Those who are not able to eat or get those resources, they're not going to be able to survive and reproduce. His other observation is really important is that the individuals vary in a population. That means there are differences, okay? So whether it's physical differences that he observes, we now know that it's actually genetic differences as well, which cause those physical differences. But he can see very obviously that the individuals in a given population, they're very different from one another. And lastly, another important observation is that he sees that many variations are heritable. Again, he doesn't have the knowledge of DNA at this point, but he sees that the parents and the offspring are very similar. So if, for example, you had, we talked about this a few days ago, a giraffe with a really long neck, well, most likely that trait is also found in its offspring, and I can actually visibly see that. Even with our genetics examples, a purple flower plant ends up having more purple flowers, right? We see those patterns repeating in nature. So his inference from these two is that some individuals will inherit traits that increase chances of survival and reproductive success. So if it's an advantage to an organism to have a really tall neck, long neck to reach food, that particular trait is going to help me survive and therefore help me to reproduce. So I will see that that trait will pass on to my offspring. So he uses these two big concepts here to come up with his theory of evolution, theory of evolution by natural selection. So here I've sort of rewritten what we have just talked about, but putting them both together. So beneficial traits for a given environment become more common in populations over time after each generation. So this is essentially the first time we've had a real mechanism, real steps for how evolution occurs. So this turns out to be his theory of natural selection. Okay, he sees that these traits that are good in a given environment are going to become more and more popular as time goes on. So what we move into then is sort of like a rephrase of that. And I was mentioning this word of fitness. We're going to go into that with a bit more detail here. But he notices that healthy populations, as I said, produce way more offspring than could possibly survive and reproduce. And we see that they have genetic diversity. They have variations in their physical traits. So some individuals in these situations have a better chance of survival than others, and that the traits that increase survival are going to be passed to offspring. So if I'm able to survive and reproduce, there must be some trait that I have that allows me some advantage to do that. As I was mentioning before, this is very much environment dependent. So in one environment, a trait might be really advantageous. We talked about this in another lesson, but in another environment, that same trait is actually detrimental. So it's very much dependent on the environment that you're looking at. So that brings us to a very famous phrase called survival of the fittest. So fitness, when we're talking about evolution, is really reproductive success. Are you able to survive to reproduce? So if you are able to survive but not reproduce, that would be a very low fitness. Okay, that is not fitness in terms of evolution. Because in terms of evolution, the entire goal is to produce offspring that has the same genes that you have. Okay, so individuals who are able to survive and reproduce in an environment have a higher fitness than others. Okay, and we'll see that that concept comes up again and again. So a couple of examples. Here we have our favorite example that we've talked about many times, which are bacteria. So antibiotic resistant bacteria. So the ones that are resistant to treatment of antibiotics, they are more fit than the non-resistant ones. We talked about previously that the ones that are not resistant to antibiotics, they will get killed off and they are not able to reproduce in that way. The resistant bacteria, though, as we've talked about, can become very dangerous. They can reproduce really, really fast and continue growing their own population. We also see another example with, we see lots of examples of this with birds, actually, but in the animal kingdom, we have what's called sexual selection. So males who have the larger and brighter colors in their plumage, they tend to attract more females, okay? So in this sense, they have a very much higher reproductive success, okay? They're able to actually reproduce more frequently than males that perhaps have a smaller plumage or have darker coloring, right? Coloring that's not as attractive to the females. And then the last example I'll just put here is we see a lot of the time competition between males in the animal kingdom. So the stronger male who's able to actually survive, he will have a higher fitness because he will be the one able to then reproduce with the females. So these are all sort of examples that we're going to come back around to as we continue on. But basically, these all have what we call an adaptation, okay? Something that makes or gives the organism an advantage in their particular environment, okay? So I'll just go back for 1 minute to our antibiotic resistant example. Well, if there's no antibiotics present in that particular environment, then having that trait is not advantageous, okay? It's not considered an adaptation. But in an environment where that's present, having that trait is an adaptation. It is advantageous to you. So any trait that allows you to survive and reproduce in that environment, we would call an adaptation. So that's sort of like a definition. Some examples of this, again, it could be colors of things. It could be that you grow poisonous leaves that things can't eat. It could be strength, and et cetera, et cetera. There are lots of examples of adaptations. We're going to talk about more of them as we continue on. The last thing I'll leave you with in this lesson, which is a very famous example of natural selection, where nature determines what things survive and therefore evolution, is Galapagos finches, also sometimes called Darwin's finches. So in this diagram, I'm showing essentially time, okay, how a population changes over time. And I've just decided to break it up into like 4 parts. What I will say here is that this can take an extremely long time. So as I mentioned previously in the course, something like bacteria, which reproduce really fast, that also means they can evolve really fast because they've got generations coming very quickly. Things like humans and other animals, we evolve very, very slowly. And the reason is that we don't reproduce very fast. So it's going to take us a really long time to actually eliminate those negative traits, or also to increase the frequency of those positive or adaptive traits. So this example is, again, really famous. We call them Darwin's finches or Galapagos finches. So what has happened here is that we have an ancestral population. I mentioned in the last lesson, these likely came from Ecuador. These likely came from the mainland of South America, the coastal South America. And all of these birds have the same size of beaks. So what we would call like a medium beak size, okay? Now, when they arrive at the Galapagos on the different islands, they're going to have availability of lots of different types of seeds. So you can see the seeds are like large, small, medium, and so forth, okay? Now, imagining, and of course, this is an oversimplification, we start off with a small population. Over time, of course, that population is going to grow because those individuals will reproduce. Now, unfortunately, if you notice really closely in here, some of these new population are going to have variation, right? Some will have larger beaks, some will have smaller beaks, some will have medium beaks, and so forth. Now, because the population has grown, as I mentioned before, there's lots more offspring, lots more individuals. Unfortunately, some of them are not going to be able to survive. They're going to be outcompeted. So in this kind of scenario that I'm describing here, there is genetic and physical variation, different sizes of beaks. But as I said, as we move forward, that becomes a competition, which is like in the 3rd column. So those birds that have really large beaks, they're going to be able to eat any of the food source, right? They can eat small, medium, or large seeds. The ones with really tiny beaks, they're not going to be able to eat everything. They only have basically the one option, the one smallest seed. So in this scenario, the finches that have a larger beak have the advantage, okay? Their fitness is going to be a lot higher. And as I mentioned before, if those birds are able to survive, they're going to be able to reproduce themselves a lot more, Okay, so what we see in number 4, and I've written evolution there, we see a population now at the end, which is again over many, many years, many, many generations. We see that the population actually has a higher frequency of large beaks. That's because in number 3, the larger beak ones were able to survive and reproduce. Therefore, in the next generations that follow that, we're going to see that large beaks continue to increase in frequency. And I'll go back to something that is from like lesson 1 of this unit, the whole concept of evolution. It's a change in frequency over time. Okay, so here we have a change in frequency of the beak size. We started with a population all with medium sized beaks. We end up many generations later with more of a frequency, higher frequency of those with the larger beaks. One thing I'll just mention here, and this goes back to what I said originally, this idea of natural selection. Well, how is nature actually contributing to this? What I was mentioning was that there's going to be something in nature that guides this process. And in this particular example, it's the source of food. Okay. Those who are able to use the food source are able to survive and reproduce. Those who are not able to use it, unfortunately, don't survive. So we'll see more examples of this as we continue on, but this is one of the most famous examples, mostly because it's one of the first ones that Darwin actually documented of natural selection. So again, this whole thing is showing the process of natural selection that leads to evolution of the population.